I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Movie Star Magic. And this week we're going to be looking at the career of Paul Rudd, a fascinating man, because his career is still not over, but he's an interesting sort of modern day movie star that I wanted to cover and sort of talk about his relationship to pre-Marvel, post-Marvel, talk about his career arc and that sort of defining feature that everyone loves Paul Rudd, but what is it about him that he's so compelling? But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is talk about a movie star and break down their career and try to understand what makes them great. The first half of the video, I give a sort of full breakdown of their career arc. I break down their career into 3 different chapters, defining a role that's classic to that chapter and indicative of that chapter and what's great about them in that movie. So a little bit of movie discussion, a little bit of sort of career arc, overall Hollywood discussion, and then also in the second half of the video, try to understand that defining feature, what makes them such an interesting movie star persona, movie star magic. What is that magic that they have? And Paul Rudd is probably one of the more recent actors that we've done. Usually I try to do actors whose career are in the sort of twilight zone where we understand their sort of final chapter. But I don't know if we totally understand Paul Rudd's final chapter yet. But despite that, he's had such a sort of varied movie star career that I want to touch on that. So starting off by breaking his career down, the first chapter I'm going to name the bit player. This is before he is a leading man, and he's very interesting in a lot of these supporting roles, often doing these comedies. Of course, he starts off, I think the most notable main first role that he had being Cher's stepbrother in Clueless. So we see him as sort of a potential viable romantic lead. He tries to do some sort of romantic type movies. He tries to do the sort of boring best friend or supporting kind of guy thing with something like even, Romeo and Juliet with Claire Danes and Leonardo DiCaprio. And I think really sort of in the sort of early 2000s understands his true movie star element when he's in Wet Hot American Summer and teams up with David Wayne and Michael Showalter, but particularly more so David Wayne, in which he has a terrific sort of collaborative relationship on throughout the decade and into the 2000s, but Wet Hot American Summer sort of defining him as a young comedic talent. Then of course has his sort of run on Friends, positioning even more so into that comedic element, and then in 2004 getting with the sort of Apatow crew, starring in Anchorman, then eventually being in 40-Year-Old Virgin and Knocked Up, and then Forgetting Sarah Marshall. I would say that sort of period from Cher's stepbrother in 95 to 2008 with Forgetting Sarah Marshall, he's so great as these supporting roles, as these sort of bit players, where he probably could have been a leading man early, and he tried to sort of do that early on in his career, and then I was like, you know what, it's probably a lot more fun to be the sort of supporting ensemble, weird, absurdist comedy guy, and really sort of worked well within that zone. So when I'm talking about the defining role of this sort of bit player, supporting, comedic period of Rudd's career, how could I not? I gotta go with Anchorman, the first Anchorman, even though the second one is kind of underrated as well. But I think, he's almost underrated in how funny he is for this. It's always sort of the Brick Tamland and, of course, Ron Burgundy. This is definitely the Will Ferrell show. But Paul Rudd is a great sort of counterpart to those guys, being the sort of womanizer, which, of course, on one part plays into the sort of satire that the movie is bringing to the sort of 70s machismo male culture. He's very much indicative of that, being the womanizer, being the guy with the cologne of Sex Panther. He seems totally sort of committed to the sort of absurdist nature and style and brand of comedy that's in Anchorman. And because of his ability to just play everything so straight and play this character as if he was sort of a real guy and have him sort of have motivations and goals and these sort of unique sub-niche things that he's into, like the perfume, Rudd just does a terrific job at showing that he can stand with the big guns. He's really one of the big heavyweight comedic guys, even though we don't really see him that way. He's in Anchorman, he's in 4-Year-Old Virgin, he is in This Is the End eventually, he is in Forgetting Sarah Marshall, which he's so funny in. He just knows his part, he's so good at that, he's so good at sort of taking these weird and oddly strange characters that feel very specific and totally committing to that bit. And Brian Fantina in Anchorman is probably the most iconic and definitely the funniest. Then in chapter 2, I'm calling this the sensitive modern man. This is when he starts to actually become a true leading man. He had some sort of early on touches of it early on in his career, but really now he's one of sort of Apatow's guys. Siegel got his own starring thing. Jonah Hill, Seth Rogen, so Hollywood's looking for the next comedy star. And Rudd does his own sort of brand, of course teaming with Judd for This Is 40 in 2012, but I think in 2008, 2009 does Role Models, I Love You Man, 2012 Wanderlust, 2010 Dinner with Schmucks, but sort of through line with those sort of pre-Ant-Man leading man comedies is just how interested he is in mixing in the sort of human drama within the comedy. I think a lot of these roles have Rudd being funny, but they're not sort of overtly funny. They're not so absurd as something like Anchorman. They do try to have sort of a true human dramatic sort of tension and story throughout them. They're very much like James L. Brooks type movies or later Apatow kind of movies than they are, say, Adam McKay-esque movies. He tries to go more of that route. So he has these interesting characters where he'll play sort of this sensitive guy or this sort of weird nerdy guy in something like I Love You Man, just looking for a friend, or he'll play sort of more of the straight guy in Wanderlust or in Dinner with Schmucks. But there's always something sort of interesting about those movies where they're trying to explore spirituality and they're not just sort of total out-and-out farces aside from something like Dinner with Schmucks. There's always sort of some extra little human growth, human drama, tension, relationship element. Something like This Is 40 is a classic example of a movie being very funny, but not being so out and out funny as something like Knocked Up, because it also has this sort of interest in being a movie about this relationship and what it actually is like to be 40 and the complications and financial issues and therapy and stemming, relationships and traumatic experiences from your parents and how that influences you. And it tries to really understand and unpack those things, yes, in a funny way, but in this sort of confronting way. But what I think is sort of the best mix of sort of genuine sentimental human pathos drama and comedy that Rudd seems so connected to in this sort of leading man period of his, I think that defining role for me is Role Models. Reteaming with David Wayne post Wet Hot American Summer, fascinating to see, the follow-up project really putting Rudd in at despite the amazing cast of Wet Hot American Summer, he sort of chooses Rudd as his guy. And I think Role Models is a super underrated movie because sort of was lost within the shuffle. But I do think that it is sort of the perfect combination of what Rudd was trying to do in this period. Just the general conceit of these guys who are selling energy drinks to kids who get into trouble and then have to do this mentoring buddy kind of a system, adopting pseudo and mentoring these two kids during volunteer time. It gives them sort of the conceit of these guys don't want to be doing this. They're not the traditional guys to be doing this. They have their own sort of retired adolescence thing going on. So they're able to have a genuine sort of excuse, we'll call it, to have these really kind of irresponsible and vulgar guys around these kids. But then, of course, it allows them to grow and allows them to have a real connection with these kids, to see themselves within their sort of relationships and their struggles and to work out stuff of their own. So it has that sort of both. It can be sort of funny and vulgar, and just that general conceit is totally kind of absurd. But I do think in the end of the movie, in the sort of last LARPing kind of medieval action set piece, we'll call it, I think is one of the most sort of genuinely sentimental but truthful and emotionally affecting scenes of the 21st century. I was really surprised at hey, this is a funny, absurdist kind of a comedy, but sneakily they're putting in these sort of scenes of emotional interest. And by the end of the movie, I think both Rudd and Sean William Scott are able to show their emotional and dramatic range more so than any other movie they've ever done because of the setup we've been building. So when we have that sort of final climactic scene that is so sort of heartwarming and wholesome, it feels genuine. It doesn't feel sappy. And I think that's sort of the mix that Rudd was always looking for, that he didn't always achieve, but I do think he achieved a lot of times. Now, despite movies like This Is 40 and Role Models and Dinner for Schmucks and Wanderlust not being huge successes, they all have sort of developed, and I Love You Man too, have all developed a sort of cult reputation. Now, they're not these huge box office successes like 40-Year-Old Virgin and Knocked Up, but they all have their own appreciation, and I think all were sort of warmly received enough to have a positive reputation of Paul Rudd. He's always playing this kind of a similar guy, everyman, kind of a generic, boring guy that is sort of leaning into the goofy elements. But I think when he really leans into the goofy elements like Role Models, sometimes it's tough to get to the more sensitive, dramatic stuff. but Roald walks that line really terrifically. Then in the third chapter, I'm calling this the superhero, because in 2015, Paul Rudd's career wasn't as maybe top of the world as a lot of people think it was, but he got the sort of part of a lifetime in Ant-Man, and is in this great part of the MCU, in my opinion, where he's clearly at the part where we know that this is a successful franchise, but still early enough where he is still one of the new characters aside of that Avengers core. And the unfortunate thing, even though as much as I like the MCU movies, the unfortunate thing with the MCU movies is that his last 10 years or so have been Ant-Man 1, Ant-Man 2, Ant-Man 3, Avengers Endgame, Civil War. He just has sort of contractually obligated to show up in a lot of these movies and have his own sort of trilogy. In one part successful because of, the first movie being well liked and warmly received, but also sort of unfortunately just ties him up. Now, that being said, I think he's more active than many of the other movie stars in Avengers. Robert Downey Jr. has done very few movies during that Avengers period. Same thing with Chris Evans. But Paul Rudd was able to actually do a lot of movies, whether that be Mute or The Catcher Was a Spy. The issue being, in those movies, he really tries to do these dramatic stuff in which he's not very successful in it. Even the TV shows he's tried, Living with Yourself and The Shrink Next Door, have received sort of mixed to negative reviews that, aren't sort of the traditional brand of goofy humor. So when we think of Paul Rudd, and I look at his career, it's like, wow, no, he's really a comedy star. He can try to do drama, but he hasn't been that successful at it. He really is like a kind of a Seth Rogen or a Steve Martin, I always thought, in this sort of ability to just be truthfully a comedy star and be great at just that, and not really sort of successful at the dramatic stuff. And be known for that and be fine with that, but still sort of failing to be sort of the Jim Carrey that can sort of jump over, or the Robin Williams that can jump over. But when we're talking about the defining role of this period, the superhero period, I have to go with the superhero movie Ant-Man. And I love Ant-Man. Let me not sort of say that. It's unfortunate that Paul Rudd has to do a lot of these MCU movies, but I am glad that he was Ant-Man, because it's a little bit of a strange choice when you think about it, but it is the perfect movie when you actually understand what the movie is, which is just a Paul Rudd movie that's a heist, where he has a genuine human pathos that he's able to sort of deliver in his leading man career, because this is, about a redemption story about a burglar, an unlikely hero, a guy who's almost, laughable to think of him as the hero, eventually becoming the hero. So it has that sort of absurdist element, but it also has this sort of emotional connection with his fact that he's trying not to be a deadbeat dad, and we see that he cares and loves for his daughter. So we have that sort of genuine human interest element to it, but then also you have the sort of the humor with the fact that he is a burglar, the fact that Ant-Man, really, are we really going to do this? Is it really going to be funny? And they sort of lean into that ridiculousness and that absurdism, and that's sort of those two lanes that he's operated so well in. And Ant-Man is sort of perfectly made for that, because he can have his weird, goofy friends and Michael Pena, but then at the end of the day, he can have that superhero movie moment that is ultimately still about human people. And I think that is super helpful when we're talking about the later movies in the MCU. And I don't think Endgame would work as well if we not had the sort of genuine human superhero origin movie with something like Ant-Man. And that's why the MCU is sort of secretly underappreciated, undervalued, because there's such, all of the sort of basis of the characters, I think, are based in true, genuine, interesting human stories, so that when we go to space, we have a care for them. Because if you just watch Infinity War, you're going to go, why do we care about these characters? Why are we going to space? It makes no sense. But because if you're invested within the MCU, like I am, and many people are, you understand their backgrounds first with these origin movies. I think Ant-Man is a classic one at that, because ultimately it's just a really funny heist Paul Rudd movie. So now talking about the defining feature of Paul Rudd, the title of this video being The Attainable Everyman. When watching many of Rudd's movies, a lot of them are kind of alike. He plays a sort of Paul Rudd type character, very rarely transforming, very rarely even having different facial hair or hairstyles. He has sort of this sort of traditional look, whether it be in Missions or Wanderlust or I Love You Man. If you just put those posters side by side, it's like it's a guy in a suit or in a sort of polo or a tie or something, and he kind of looks very generic. And in many ways, he is kind of generic characters. They're not always super interesting. But what he's able to do is bring these sort of absurdist or goofy or silly attitudes to these guys. And that's why I say the attainable everyman, because he is very much an everyman, like a Tom Hanks. He seems like a guy you'd know and have drinks with and want to be your friend. But what I think is also interesting is that He doesn't have this sort of Val Kilmer-esque Adonis, Chris Hemsworth, Greek god body. He's oftentimes playing a little tubby, or a little bit maybe overplaying the tubbiness, but sort of just a regular shaped kind of a guy, not that tall. He's got, of course, incredible anti-aging serum or whatever he uses. He looks terrific in terms of his face, and his aging is absolutely incredible. But I do think he does seem like sort of a more of a regular guy than a traditional big superhero type. And I think what that does is able to, of course, we talk about this many weeks, but utilize those physical features to create something that is interesting, to create a relatable character, similar to like a Tom Hanks or a Julia Roberts, trying to be that sort of everyman type, and bringing, I think, absurdism and goofiness and real silliness and fun to these movies. Also trying to, like I said, have that human pathos element to it, but trying to be an everyman that every man wants to be. So he's done this sort of persona many times, but that persona is just one of my favorites, because by creating sort of using his looks as sort of a traditional everyman, and by giving a lot of these characters a likability and a charisma and a relatability, whether it's his line deliveries or whether it's sort of his improvisation and goofy kind of fun, loose hang kind of an attitude that he brings a lot to these characters, what he's able to do is create something that is relatable. And when you have a more relatable character, that becomes, I think, a little bit more emotionally invested in these characters. When you believe that this is a real guy, therefore the movies become a little bit more realistic, and therefore the relationships that he has throughout the movies, or the sort of human drama within them, become more relatable too, because you have a really realistic character, because you really believe that this guy has existed. You therefore you can make the sort of logical leap within the plot. So there's a strong connection there between his relationships between the characters in the movie, but also his relationship between the audience and us, because we sort of like Paul Rudd, and he's done such a great job at creating this sort of genuine, fun-loving, nice guy. I think that lends a lot to his stories and to the storylines of his movies, and that's sort of his defining feature. What he brings to it is that sort of nice guy, we'll call it energy, allows the filmmakers to have more successful, genuine, emotional arcs within their movies. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your favorite Paul Rudd movies in the comments down below. Are you excited for Ant-Man 3 entering the Quantumania? I sure am. And I think that, his career post-Marvel will be interesting too. I can't wait for him to be this sort of funny old man in these movies. He's always doing these great cameos. This is the end. He was just in Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. I love that he does that kind of stuff too. Bob's Burgers, he's in the most recent movie. So he's always doing fun stuff, and that's one of my favorite things about Paul Rudd. He's always going to be doing fun, unique, interesting parts, and I hope he does continue that. So he's one of these guys I wanted to cover because of his career. Is, I think, actually underrated and fascinating, because it is very much an MCU career, so we see how that changes, but also sort of he was part of that Apatow generation, but he was also sort of an early 90s leading man. He's done quite a lot within his short lifespan, and I gotta say, whatever he's using on his face, lotion or anti-aging, whatever, I want some of it, because he definitely looks terrific. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, stay tuned.